Alright, so we sent the unit off to the radiator shop. They were able to do a little bit of testing, not a proper test on it. But all they were able to do was 100 psi on it. These things should be tested at a much higher rate because they will handle much higher psi's for air conditioning. Fortunately, I tried to order several new units from several manufacturers. Unfortunately, they all had some issue, whether it would be a stud that passes through the opposite side of the hose was too big, or the side pipes were not angled or long enough, something like that. So word to the wise, if you're looking for one of these online, at least here in the States, I've had all kinds of trouble trying to find a proper replacement that actually just bolts right on. So I'm going to take a chance, see if maybe he's right. Maybe it simply was just fine. And we're going to go ahead and tighten these back down. Just some Torx here. Hold that on to the radiator. You have a tongue at the bottom on each side. There's no bolt. It just simply, the metal tang that comes over slides down into it. Same thing at the top. You have a metal tang that goes behind a plastic retainer, and the bolt just passes through that plastic retainer and then screws into a threaded section on the condenser itself. I do not have torque specs on these, but I guarantee it's not much. I wouldn't say more than a couple 3 Newton meters for these. I'm just going off a hand tight. Feels good. It should be just fine. So this unit's ready to go back in the car. You also have a bracket on the passenger side of the radiator, assuming you're on an American car. Pretty much just a metal bracket with a piece of foam. This goes on these 2 tabs here that have holes in them. So you just simply line up the holes on the bracket with the holes on the radiator and screw your 8mm bolts in place. And like I said, that's an 8mm flanged bolt. That, you've got 2 of them, and this protects your pipes on your condenser. Not a whole lot of torque. A couple of Newton meters is all you're going to need. This upper one, the condenser pipe kind of gets in the way, but you can get onto it with a wrench instead of the ratchet. Cleaned out the tray where the radiator is going to go, right here in the front brace. Make sure all of our coolant and everything's cleared out. So we're fixing to lower that back in. Another note is make sure all your lines and connectors and all that are back out of your way, so that when you start putting all this back in, you're not crushing or getting one of them trapped in somewhere that you don't want it and have to pull it back out just to get it back in place. We've got the 2 hoses. I've kind of rocked them back and caught them behind something else to help hold them out of the way. Same thing over here for our connector for the fan pressure sensor on the pipe. We just simply have to watch our lines over here for the dryer and rock it in there. You're going to kind of go in with the bottom at an angle towards the front of the car, and then you're going to rock it back once you get it in place. It's much easier if you got 2 people. Like I said, we're going to rock the bottom in first. It's a pretty snug fit. Yeah. From the bottom, you'll have to get underneath there, check and make sure the guides are popping in place. They're real similar to what you see up here on the top, and there's just a little round section that fits it perfectly. They should drop right in there. Once you've done that, your radiator's in place. With the radiator in place, you're going to reattach your hoses. You'll have to get your dryer here, just right to the side of the radiator. It's got a steel hose that becomes rubber, and it's got a fitting on it that hooks right down into the condenser. It only has 1 connector pointing the right direction, so not confusing there at all. All you're going to do is pop it down. There's a stud that goes up through the opening, and then you run a 10mm flange nut down. That torque is going to be 10 Newton meters. I've got it just down hand tight right now. I'll go back and torque it once I get some more things in place. So our rubber hoses, you should be able to bend them back and then pop them back on. Give them a little jiggle to get them back all the way seated. Then we'll get a clamp on here in a minute for that. New aluminum housing. We put our lower radiator back on that. Make sure it goes all the way down like it should. And of course we'll have to get the pliers to get that hose clamp back in place here in a second. Now down here on this side you have of course the send and return transmission cooler lines that hook into the radiator. Those are exactly the length they have to be to get to where they go, so there shouldn't be any confusion on which one goes where. I did put like a rubber grommet over those to keep them from leaking all over the floor. I've also got the other AC hose over here, which will hook into the line that crosses at the lower section of the radiator. We won't worry about that until we actually get the car up in the air. It's much easier to get down to that at that time. As for our transmission coolers, I'm going to get those back in place. So it is a flanged pipe, the one that has a 90-degree bend in it. Just goes right in beside the radiator, the lower radiator hose. And I am reusing my O-rings for these because they're just fine. There's nothing wrong with them. Do be sure and check them when you get a chance before you hook them back up. We can get our lower one down and out of the way so it's ready to go in. Once we lift the car up, you have to move your radiator hose back and forth until you can get around it how you need to with your cooler lines. Do not forget your fan connector on this driver's side. Be sure and get it pushed down to where you can get it connected back up. And do remember to remove any plugs, as well as I did use a little bit of some of my shop rags to plug some of these lines to keep debris and stuff from getting in them. So you do want to make sure you pull any of that out before you close it all up. And I've left the radiator loose during this process so that if I need to do any kind of shifting or moving around, it makes it much easier when the radiator is already loose. So I have the upper cooler hose in place, have the nut pretty much hand tight. Be sure and have those pushed all the way in before you start tightening that nut. That way you don't have it kind of catch at an odd angle and wind up pinching your O-ring and damaging it. These hose clamps are rather difficult. So just get you a light here, make sure you're in the right place. Make sure you get past that first knuckle on this flange to where the hose slides over, and then you should be good. This next one should be much easier. Once again, going to have to kind of reposition, get a little tighter clamp on this to get it to spread just a bit more. Should be able to get on there no problem. And there we go. So once again, we're getting right past the knuckle of the pipe. We don't want to be all the way into the hose, so just kind of somewhere in the middle there. And it's going to hold that hose on. It's not going anywhere. So we've got our upper and lower radiator hose on at this point. Technically, we can go ahead and fill it with coolant, but I want to go ahead and get the other parts on and get focused on being able to refill the AC as well. I'm wiping down everything else under here, just make sure we're good and clean. Don't have any coolant residue or anything hanging out. Next part is our lower transmission cooler line. It's right down here. I'd already actually popped it into the port. Just double checking, making sure the O-ring and everything looks good. Right here, you can see the large nut there. And that's the pipe that runs down to the lower section of the cooler for the transmission. So the hose looks good and everything. The seal looks good, the O-ring looks good. I'm going to slide this back on, everything looks lined up, and run it down by hand. Okay, we got a good snug fit just by hand. We now have our coolant line that's over here, and we also have the fan motor connector. Go ahead and connect that connector. It's just a simple large 2-pin connector for that fan motor. And it's got a C guide here to snap the looming that's around the wire in and keep that line out of harm's way. It's pretty tight off in there. May have to reroute some things to get that cooler line in place. So on the opposite side, we've got another fan motor and the connector for the AC pressure sensor, as well as another coolant line. So here's our connector for the fan and the connector for the pressure sensor. And connect our fan back up. Once again, just a simple 2-pin with a loom and then a clamp here to help keep that wire in place. And one more clamp right there to hold that wire in place. You can see our other clamp right there for the pressure sensor. Get our AC cross line in here. It goes right across, right behind the radiator here, underneath the fans, and it connects these two. We're going to put the cross pipe in for the AC. So the straight section is going to go to the passenger side, and the section that elbows out will go on the driver's side. And it actually elbows towards the rear of the car. As we line this up, I'm going to make sure we line up our hoses and get our O-rings in place. And same thing on the passenger side. I'm going to line it up and get that in place. Now there are some clips that go on the radiator fan shroud that hold this all in place. Unfortunately, my clip's been broken and I haven't replaced it yet. A 10mm flange nut, and those are also 10 Newton meter torque once you do go to torque them down. We've got the one on the opposite side, as you can see right there. This one's a lot easier to get to. It's a much larger opening right here, close to the oil pan drain. Make sure those are seated good. That way when you torque it down, you're not crushing the O-ring and causing a leak. And that one there, you can barely see it right there behind the sway bar. Right here. I'm about to tighten up the return line for the transmission cooler. And that is a 15/16 is what I'm able to get on here nice and tight. And once you run it down with your hand like I did before, you shouldn't have to give it more than just, just a little bit of a turn. And it feels tight, you should be good. I don't have a torque spec on that one either, but like I said, just get it tight and then check it once you run it for a minute. Make sure it's not leaking anywhere. Those rubber seals don't require a whole lot of torque, just enough to kind of keep it tight so it doesn't come loose, and a little compression to seal it up. I'm now gonna torque down our AC lines. You kind of have to get in here. They're supposed to be 10 Newton meters, which works out to about 88.5 inch-pounds. Because I'm running a long extension, of course I bumped that up a little bit to make up for the torque we're going to lose in the extension. So I'm actually running right about 100 inch-pounds. So you've got two on this side, the two lines that are coming off the condenser into the two lines for the dryer, and the return line to the compressor. Okay, there we go. Then I got to do the one over on the opposite side. Be sure and watch your lines as you're torquing. Make sure they're not trying to shift around on you too much. This one here is moving on me quite a bit because it is on a rubber hose. So I may have to try to help hold it and support it. There we go. Those should be nice and tight, ready to put Freon into the system at this point. I'm also going to tighten down the other line for the transmission cooler up here on the top of the radiator. Once again, I'd already got that in position. Got it to where the seal was touching, and then run it down with my fingers. So at this point, we just need to just give a little touch of torque here. Make sure that doesn't back off, and then it makes a good seal. Double check all your hoses, make sure nothing's rubbing or anything like that. Several of these hoses are very, very close on this driver's side. Between your AC line, your cooler hoses, your radiator hose. You've also got some power steering lines right here. So you got quite a bit going on right here in this corner. So just make sure everything looks like it's clear and not rubbing on each other. At this point, I believe we're ready to put our retainer in place. This is just a thin piece of fiberglass, looks like. But anyhow, once again, another piece that is with age going to be kind of brittle, so do be careful with it. What you're looking to do here is, just like I talked about on the bottom, is you want these rubber grommets to line up with these openings, and then each one of these holes on this plate, as it goes over the front brace here, should line up with a screw hole. These are, once again, the Torx screws, and that is a T30 Torx. And we're just going to run these down by hand, get them started, and then we're going to torque them back down. Now the torque specs on these is 10 Newton meters, 88.5 inch-pounds. This here we will be setting the torque wrench for the exact spec because we are going to be on just the socket. Torque wrench to 88.5. As I thought, that sounded a bit high. I did not put them to the 88.5. That seemed a bit excessive for a piece of plastic. And rather than breaking this, I just went ahead and cinched it down to where I felt comfortable. I would say we were probably only about half the torque that they said. Be careful with some of your guides just because they say that. Be mindful, especially when you're working with plastic, as I repeat over and over again. It's time to go ahead and fill the coolant system. So we're going to use some pre-mixed universal coolant and see if we can get this topped off. Now you're going to leave this front cap off as you fill from the reservoir over here. And you keep an eye on it, and that should allow the system to relieve any air in the system so you don't have air pockets. You can also fill from up here like I'm going to do. So we definitely want to leave a air gap here between the lid and the jug. I'm going to allow for a little expansion. We're looking pretty full here. Our housing for our thermostat is pretty much right here on the edge, and it should balance out between the two, and that's where you want to be. Now we do have a cap that goes on here, and we will have to tighten that down to a specific torque. The cap itself is actually labeled for 9 Newton meters, 70 to 80 inch-pounds. Now I use the lower radiator hose to help get some air out just by simply squeezing on it gently until I see more air bubbles come out. I'm just going to screw our cap down now. Now this system is supposed to be able to bleed itself to a degree. So any air that comes out should go in here and get passed back out through here. So we should be able to run it for a little bit with this cap off and let any more air escape that may be trapped in the system. So it's going to be 79.66 inch-pounds. And I'm using an adapter to get my torque wrench on there, but all this is so short that it shouldn't make a difference. And I am slightly over torque at even 80. So there we go. So 80 inch-pounds should be perfect for this. It's got an O-ring inside there, as I showed you before, so that should cause a good seal. And I think we're ready to start it up and warm up the engine. Of course, do one final check before you start your engine. Make sure you got all your caps in place. You don't have something laying around that's going to just fall off into the engine compartment somewhere. Everything's clear. You don't have anything that's going to get caught or snagged in the belt. And I think we are clear here. Definitely seeing a few bubbles here, so we're just going to let it run for a while. Keep an eye on our coolant level, keep an eye on our gauges. It looks like the bubbles have reduced substantially. Starting to get a little steam coming out. You do see a flow of the coolant. Starting to warm up pretty good, so I'm going to close the cap. Check our gauge. I had a couple of connectors loose back here, one for the throttle position sensor and one for the coolant level sensor in the reservoir. Apparently missed those. Got those reconnected. Wound up having to restart the engine, let it run for a minute longer, and now we're at optimal temperature. So this is something that it could do over a really long time before, because the thermostat simply was just constantly open, and it was allowing it to just flow coolant, whether the engine was warm or not. So now it seems to be warming up. The next test is just going to be simply get it out on the road and see if it will maintain proper engine temperature while driving. That was the big one, was especially on cool mornings or at higher speeds up on the highway and whatnot, the engine would never be at optimal temperature. So this should resolve all that, as well as I will get my AC system vacuumed, and we'll work on getting it refilled so we'll have air conditioning in our lovely hot Texas summer. But I do have a couple of codes to clear because I made the accident of not getting those connectors connected before I started it. So I'll get those cleared as well and make sure they stay gone, and double check everything else just to make sure I don't have any leaks. You may notice a little steam floating up here and there because there was a little coolant that did get down in the valley. Of course, that's going to kind of bake off. Once the engine cools back down and everything, we will give it a good cleaning, and that'll help get the rest of that off so that it'll no longer be baking coolant in the channel here. Also want to double check, look down off in there on our housing, make sure we don't have any coolant leaks coming from anything down there. Everything's looking good, so just be vigilant on checking everything once you've got it all together. Last but not least, before I take it in to get the AC serviced and get it refilled so I can have some air conditioning, you need to put your air dam back on, of course. So be sure to mount it up using all your rivets that you had with it. You may have to buy new ones. Any of them were damaged during the removal. So be sure and lift it up in place, run your screws in the bottom to help hold it in place, and then you can do all your plastic pop rivets last. Just get it lined up. You should have 3 Phillips head with large washer screws. Go ahead and get those started. Just make sure you have everything lined up before you run these in. And these, of course, are just a standard number 2 Phillips. Kind of lightly get those in place, not really torquing them down quite yet, just enough to hold it up in its position so that I can make sure it doesn't need to shift left or right. So I have to back them off just a hair because I am a slight bit to the passenger side. I feel like a little tight on this side, so I'm going to go ahead and run a couple of rivets in. I've put my 2 rivets in on this wheel well. I put the last rivet in over on this side for these 2. And this holds the wheel well plastic covering that holds it to the rear side of your front air dam here. So now I've got that in place good. Check my holes, make sure they're lining up. So now I can go ahead and tighten down the screws. Once again, just get them good and snug. They ain't got to be real tight. It says plastic, it will break. Now I just need to put the 4 pins on each side. So I'm actually replacing mine with some new ones. So the ones I had were rivets, so once you pop them loose, you can't reuse them. You don't actually have a head to reuse. So I've been having to reach inside, make sure they're snug together, and then push the pin in. And there we go. Last one, you may have to kind of reach up through here, hold those together, push your pin. There we go. Nice and tight. Not going anywhere.